Thanks very much for being here, and thanks particularly for the organisers for putting together this wonderful workshop, and especially for being open and inclusive to people who are not NLP people. I'm not one of those people, I'm a mere psychologist. But I've seen the light, and that's why I'm working with Ekaterina, who will be presenting on the NLP aspects of this work. So I'm going to try to race through a conceptual, theoretical background of this project we've been working on, and she'll give you the meat of the work itself. Despite being a psychologist, I'm interested in semantic change, and some of the work we've been doing is motivated by a particular account of what I call concept creep. And when I refer to this work, I usually use an elaborate colour naming metaphor, which comes back from work done 50 years ago by Berlin and Kay on the change in colour naming practices. The basic idea, as you may know, is that most languages seem to have certain focal colour points, but the breadth of the colour concepts varies greatly, both in hue and in intensity. So Hung, for instance, in Mandarin, has a very narrow reference from that standpoint, whereas Vermel in Catalan is extremely broad. And what I'm referring to as concept creep is simply the process through which the meaning of a psychological concept, in this case, expands or inflates over time to encompass a wider range of reference. So here's my sort of non-linguistic amateurish account of this. When developing this idea, I said, perhaps at any point in time, a humankind concept, a concept referring to a form of human experience or a kind of person, refers to a certain range of phenomena qualitatively and quantitatively. And you can think about conceptual change as occurring on two dimensions. You could talk about what I call horizontal creep occurring when a concept's meaning shifts, if you like, to encompass qualitatively different phenomena, as red moving into encompass what was previously called purple, let's say. Often, for instance, extension by analogy. So at one point in time, milk referred to things produced only by female mammals. Now it includes things that are produced by nuts and the like. So that's the extension of milk to a new qualitative phenomenon. Whereas vertical creep refers to where a concept broadens its meaning, if you like, metaphorically downwards to include milder or less severe phenomena, often by relaxing the criteria in some way. So, metaphorically extending red into the pink domain. So here's an Australian product called Juicy Water. If juice was to include juicy water, which is just basically juice with water, that would amount to, if you like, a vertical expansion of the concept of juice as I was seeing it. And of course, these things aren't mutually exclusive, and conceptual change could have both of these different forms simultaneously. In the program of work I've been developing on what I call concept creep, I'm arguing a few particular things. Certain psychological concepts have, I'm stating, undergone a process of gradual semantic inflation over the last roughly 50 years. Concepts like abuse, bullying, hate, mental disorder, prejudice, and trauma. It takes those two forms, horizontal and vertical, and although quite diverse concepts have crept in this sense, I argue that they have a unifying pattern in that they all involve some sense of an expansion of the idea of harm. Harm is the superordinate idea that these concepts all participate in. And this broadening of the meaning, correlated broadening of meaning of these different concepts, is driven by some sort of increasing sensitivity to harm within our culture, meaning Anglo-American culture in this sense. And in the psychological part of this work, we try to chronicle what some of the mixed blessings of that process are, the expansion of ideas of harm. This work was laid out in a psychology journal about 3 years ago. It's got quite an amount of attention in the quality, at least American, media. It's sort of become, the concept creep idea has become part of the vernacular, features in some culture wars type products in recent times, and I won't bore you with the details. Just to say that we think this is an idea that has some contemporary political relevance. So to give you a feel for what we're talking about here, the idea of addiction at one point referred to certain dependencies, physiological dependencies on ingested substances, but over time there's been an increasing recognition within my field of so-called behavioural addictions, which are simply out-of-control behaviours of any sort, not necessarily involving ingestion. The idea of bullying at one point in time referred to childhood contexts where there was repeated intentional behaviour by someone who was more powerful towards a victim who was less powerful, and progressively in the scholarship of bullying over the last 50 years, all of those criteria have been essentially eroded, so that we now talk about bullying in organisational contexts when it's not intentional, when it's not repeated, and where there is no power differential at all. Mental disorder, everyone knows how that's broadened, both in terms of recognising new territories of psychopathology and in recognising milder variants of existing forms of psychopathology, so that a much broader proportion of humanity now is diagnosable than it was when DSM-1 appeared. Prejudice at one point referred only to blatant animosity. Now concepts of prejudice recognise milder, non-conscious, or anxiety rather than antipathy-based forms of aversion to people, and also, of course, expand it horizontally, I would say, to include more groups of humanity rather than just the racial and ethnic groups it once referred to only. And trauma at one point referred exclusively to life-threatening events outside the range of normal human experience, and more trauma has been subjectivized, something that can be experienced indirectly or vicariously, and often includes stressful life events that are very much within the normal range of human experiences. So all of these concepts have broadened. They've broadened within the field of psychology. We argue that those changed meanings disseminate into the culture more widely, and we thought that it would be a good idea to study it systematically, and that's what Ekaterina does.
Okay, so in order to examine a change in salience and meaning of related concepts, we created large text corpora in the domain of psychology that comprises of about 900,000 of abstracts covering the period of 1930 to 2017, extracted from 875 journals from 2 databases, PubMed and eResearch. So in total, we have about 133 million tokens, and on the right-hand side, you see the distribution of the number of the abstracts for each year, and you see that there is very few ones for 1960s and 1950s. So that's why we only in this work focus only on the abstracts that start from 1970s and 80s. So before we start, we did some basic pre-processing of the corpus. We removed punctuation, numbers, stop words, and non-latent characters. We also did fault casing and lemmatization using spaCy. So our first step was quite simple. So we looked at the relative frequencies of unigrams, and we did some basic smoothing, which is just moving average one. So in order to obtain the relative frequency of 1972, we just sum up 1971, 72, and 73, and average over them. So on the right-hand side, you see the relative unigram frequencies for each of the 5 concepts. So, and you see there is a significant increase in trauma. So does it mean that trauma had broadened its meaning and it appeared in a lot more contexts than other concepts? We will investigate this just shortly. If you look at harassment, which is the blue line, so harassment also increased its relative frequency until mid of 1990s. And then it started decreasing. So now let's look at this data in more detail. So we applied 2 types of models. So one is count-based model, LSA, another one is prediction-based, word-to-vec. So first for LSA, we just followed the instructions from Sagi. So in the first step, we created the global embeddings. We just looked at the 40,000 most frequent terms. We created TF-IDF matrix with logarithmic smoothing and factorized this matrix using the SVD to 200 dimensions. On the second step, we created diachronic embeddings for each decade, starting from 1980, because we have enough data for that period. So for each decade, we sampled 50 sentential occurrences. And for each sentential occurrence of the concept, we only looked at the window size of 7, so we took these global embeddings and averaged over them. We repeated this procedure 10 times, and the plot here illustrates the pairwise cosine similarities across all sentence-specific representations for each decade, for each concept. And we see that harassment has the highest cosine similarity, which means it's the most narrow concept among the 5 concepts under consideration. And whereas trauma has very low cosine similarity, and you see that it does not change much over these 4 decades. Whereas, for instance, for bullying, which is the green line, so the concept of bullying was only established in 1970s, and the most radical change happened during 80s. So that's why we see this steep increase. So now let's look at the word-to-vec. So this is just, we follow the Hamilton et al. So we trained the word-to-vec CBAO model for each decade, and then again align the embeddings using orthogonal procrustes. And again, as Chaim previously mentioned, so general thing is just to measure semantic displacement between decades. So we basically measured cosine distances between, say, 80s and 90s for each of the concepts. And you see that, again, for bullying, there's the highest cosine distance. So it was formed during that time. And the same for addiction. But for instance, if you look at the period of 2000s, most concepts do not change significantly, especially trauma changes very slightly. Okay, so now let's look at the concepts in more detail, how in particular they changed. So we first extracted the most common collocations for the concept. And for each collocation, we evaluated the cosine similarity for each decade. And here you can see that, for instance, addiction, it changes from just being associated to some substances, for instance, like alcohol, drug, or heroin, marijuana. It moves towards the behavior-specific associations, like gaming, internet, or smartphone. Then, as for bullying, so bullying was initially associated with child, and it was school-related bullying and mostly physical one. So now it moves towards adult bullying, and we have an increase of cosine similarity between workplace and bullying over decades, and it also becomes more victimized. And finally, it also, we observed that it has more non-physical behavior. So we observe there is more verbal bullying now. And now for harassment. So harassment broadens in several ways. First of all, with the internet epoch, there appears cyber and online harassment. And we also observe new contexts of peer and workplace harassment. And it has new targets such as ethnic and racial harassment. So prejudice, it's a stable or diminishing association with traditional content, and diminishing association with sexism. If you look at the sex, sexual, and women, so it all decreases, and possibly increasing for the gay. And finally, so we have trauma. So the trauma decreases the focus on just like child and childhood. And we also observe the semantic shift from physical trauma to psychological trauma. And we also see that there is more relation to stress and interpersonal trauma. So it becomes milder. So to conclude, since the 1990s, addiction, bullying, harassment have broadened, as the theory of concept creep would suggest, but the breadth of trauma has been relatively static and prejudice has somewhat narrowed. Second, the analysis of pairwise similarities demonstrated change in patterns of occurrence for each concept that clarified how its meanings have shifted and expanded over 4 decades. And finally, some concepts have acquired entirely new associations, such as cyber harassment. And some of them have added new semantic domains, such as addiction incorporating non-ingestive behaviors like gaming or smartphone use. And others have shifted emphasis, such as trauma. So trauma became more psychological than physical. So our future directions and the questions that we'd like to address are what is driving concept creep as a historical and cultural phenomenon, and what is the relationship between conceptual expansion in academic discourse and in the wider culture? What is the relationship between the rising salience and frequency of concepts and their semantic inflation? And finally, how can the emerging tools for examining historical semantic change best clarify patterns of horizontal and vertical concept creep? Thank you, and questions?